All right, where do we go for the...
To the front. If
To
you
the front.
just follow that road and then take a right,
Okay.
it'll go right to the front gate.
You look awesome, by the way.
Thank you.
You look beautiful.
Hi guys, Fantasma House. We are in Parker County, Texas. We're going to go on the Talking Tombstones tour. Missed it last year, but this year, here we go.
I'm a local mortician here, and I heard there were some prospective customers that could be coming around, and I was just taking a, well, sir, you're still a two-knotter, and by golly, I think we can squeeze it. Whoa, you're gonna take a 6-foot knotter. You're gonna take a 6-knotter. My name's Paul Bearer. And this is my wife, T. Ruth Bearer, known as Temperance to her friend. I just want y'all to know we take standing orders and we have layaway, whatever you'd prefer. We want to, you are in your business, earn your business, and we have MOURNING, morning hours and evenings by appointment. So we appreciate the tour, and don't forget, I had one group come by wrong, and then I gave my little spiel up there, and then they came back, and I said, well, I want to thank y'all for coming back for a repeat performance, because I don't have any repeat customers. So we appreciate you coming by for the first time. And we've got a distinguished guest that's here from Arlington that came by and joined it, and my fame spread far and wide now. So y'all get your orders in early, because it's going to be crowded now that I've got fame that the other side of the county line here. Y'all take care and enjoy the tour.
Awesome.
Thank y'all.
Let me get a picture of you guys.
Is that Paul Bearer? Is that the Paul Bearer? Is that from the? You're just Paul Bearer. You're not Paul Bearer.
No. Well, Paul Bearer is what
That's not where it came from.
the funeral director's coming.
Right. That's not where it came from. Though. Oh, that's interesting. Name for it is mortician. It's gotta be
This part of that.
Yeah. Well, is it Paul?
Yes, grab as much shade as possible. Anyone? who
Ma'am, you
wants
want a chair? There's one over here.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Come on around. We're going to be facing this way, so it's up to you guys. If you
So
want to
you're
sit
our
right there.
you're our docent, right?
Yes.
Tell me, what is your name again?
Nancy.
Nancy. I knew you were one of the Nancys. I said
I know there's a bunch of us.
There are several Nancys, and I'm Cheryl. This is Dave. Good to meet you.
Nice to
She's
meet
a lovely docent. I got to speak with her at the Christmas Christmas
Good to
gathering.
meet you, Lord.
I'm Irvine. I was born in 1847 in Glasgow, Scotland, and I went to school in Dublin, Ireland, at the Queen's College. Being a devout Presbyterian, I originally considered joining the ministry, but in the end I studied the arts and sciences. My family calls me Abram, but I'm a bit of a formal gentleman, and most folks call me Mr. Irvine. In 1881, I arrived in Texas, in Beaumont, where I started my first job as a bookkeeper for a sawmill.
And good afternoon. My name is Mrs. Susan Irvine, And most of you, or many of you, may know me as Susie. I went by Susie most of my life. I was born in 1862 in South Africa. My family immigrated to the U.S. when I was 4 years old in 1866. We first lived near relatives in Illinois. Then in 1878, we moved to Beaumont. My mother is Dutch, or her family is originally from Holland, and she spoke Dutch throughout her life, and my father was a British soldier. Now in 1878, when we moved to Beaumont, I met and married my dear Abram. We started our family right away. The following year in 1883, we had baby William. Unfortunately, he died as an infant. The following year, we had little Fred, and we lived in Village Mills near Beaumont because Abram had become an inspector for sawmills and traveled throughout East Texas. I was so proud. Oh, and I forgot, we had a total of 8 children, and we worked hard, we operated business, so it was a busy, busy life when we were youngsters.
In 1885, we moved to Cleburne, Texas, south of Weatherford. That's where I partnered and founded A. Irvine and Company. We dealt in things like hides, grains, hay, feed, produce, and the such. That year our daughter Emily was born, but unfortunately she passed away. Next came Robert and Annie Mae. In Cleburne, I became an elder in the United Presbyterian Church, and I was stayed that way for 22 years. Now I'll tell you, I believe in strict discipline, hard work, and Sundays are for Bible study.
Indeed. And in 1890, we decided to move to Weatherford, where we could establish the Irvine Family Bakery. With the help of my brother George Byrne, an experienced baker, we started in our home at 416 East Ackerd Street, and we worked on the first floor with our business, and the children recall the memories of the wonderful aroma of baked goods rising up to our living quarters. They loved that. Now, a baker's day begins very early in the morning, as most of you know, so the fresh bread could be baked each day. We also baked cakes, pies, cookies, candy, and hams. The family, it was primarily a family business, yet we did employ others as apprentices. The young children loved to pull taffy, so they helped pull taffy candy. The older girls worked behind the counter after school, and the boys drove a horse-drawn delivery wagon that had a big bakery box on the back. This was Weatherford's very first free delivery service or bakery.
Absolutely. So in Weatherford, we had 2 more daughters, Mary and Martha. Our church membership was transferred to the First Presbyterian Church, which is now known as the Grace First Presbyterian Church. In 1883, I was elected as an elder there as well. Susie taught Sunday school, managed the home, and also the family bakery.
Now, in 1899, we talk about Fred. Okay, we had a tragedy in early 1899 in February in the cold winter time. Young Fred was 14 years old, and he was driving the bakery delivery wagon, and he saw friends playing on some frozen ice. It wasn't very deep, but he got out there on the pond and he fell through and got wet. But he was terrified to go home. He feared his father's harsh punishment. So he went ahead and finished his delivery route, and then he developed pneumonia and he died. It just crushed our hearts. And oh, Abram, I just wish the children hadn't been so afraid of punishment going home.
Yes, dear. In 1902, we purchased a building on 220 North Main Street.
Right here.
Now, business began to flourish because it was right there off of the square. We had another loss in 1907 when our daughter Annie died. She died of pneumonia. She had just started teaching high school.
Yes, and she's buried right here beside Fred.
Yep.
Yes, at 18. So.
And then young James had his accident.
Then James, oh goodness, our youngest son James was driving the delivery wagon, and the horse got spooked, bolted, and ran. James fell into the rains, those long rains, and he was dragged a great distance, and his legs were cut severely. He lost much blood, and he had scars on his legs throughout the rest of his life.
Then my health started to decline.
Right. In 1915, Abram could feel the health decline coming on, so we decided it's time to sell the business, and we sold the bakery. We retired from the bakery, sold no, we rented out the building to Walker's Supply Company, and we just remained at home at the homestead on Ackerd Street.
Yeah.
Then,
When I passed away.
3 years later, 1918, Abram passed away. 2 years after that, I lost my mom, Martha, in Beaumont.
That was a hard drive for you to Beaumont that year.
It was a long journey, yes indeed, dear.
Yeah. And then your health started to decline.
Oh, in 1931, I could feel my health declining, so I decided it's time to sell the building. So the rock building at 220 North Main was sold to the Walker family. They had done so well over the years, and they did for many decades. They stayed there. We also had a huge baker's confectionery oven, and I sold that to the Browder family. If anyone is familiar with the Browders, you might know that they were in the confectionery business and made candies and things, so that oven was a blessing to them. Our income was from rental property and investments.
You were a really shrewd businesswoman.
Yes, I had to be very conservative, and especially through the Great Depression years. And I carried the note when I sold the building. I carried that note myself. And when I passed away the following year, from 1931 to 1932, I died in 1932, and my estate included our homestead, stocks, bonds paying 7%, and rental income from rental property in Fort Worth. So we did okay.
But she had to do things modestly, and so we see that Fred has a formal stone here, and then the rest of the stones are a little bit more modest. Now, one of the things that's a little bit interesting is, so I was born in 1847, but my stone says 1848.
Sorry, dear. It's like I should have caught that, and maybe I did, but it's been a while. And anyway, I blame the funeral home.
Yeah, and then you see hers over the years. We'll just have to take a word for it, because unfortunately all the letters are gone.
Everything's gone. Mine just has a blank plate. So, oh well, what can you do?
Yeah. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out and giving us this opportunity to tell you this story.
Indeed. Thank you so much for visiting.
Thank
It was
you.
good to have people again. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hey, another good audience. I love performing in front of a large audience, and I love performing in front of a live audience. Much more fun than what else is here. Okay, here I go. I need you to watch. What does this remind you of?
Statue.
Say it again.
The statue.
Where's my statue?
Outside the library.
The statue in front of the Weatherford Public Library. I have a wonderful story to tell you of my wonderful life, but since I lived to be almost 77 years old, the director said I only could have you for 5 or 6 minutes. Very hard to get 5 or 6 minutes out of 77 years. So 3 things I want to remind you of. 1, my statue, my bronze, is in front of the Weatherford Library, and that was made scaled to my size when I was Peter Pan on the stage. This is what happens if Peter Pan does grow up. You know, that does happen to us. So I have my statue in front of the library, and there's some other memorabilia in the library about me. The second thing is the DOS. You need to go to the DOS Heritage and Cultural Center. If you've never been there, shame on you. It's free, it's wonderful. There's a lot of wonderful things to see, and it's especially good to take children there because they do pioneer days and things like that. The third thing is there's an elementary school, Mary Martin Elementary, and every year they give a performance. They're 5th graders, and it's my understanding that it's absolutely wonderful. That it's just, they do it at the high school, and it's as good a performance as you'll see anywhere, even though it's an elementary school. So like I said, I lived to be almost 77, only 1 month shy of my 77th birthday. I was born on December the 1st, 1913. I was born on the 1st because I was very excited to get here. I had a lot to do, and I was ready to do it. I had an older sister named Geraldine, but I called her sister all my life. She was born 4 years before me, and then between sister and myself, 2 years after her and 2 years before me, we had a brother, but unfortunately he only lived for 1 day, which grieved my mother very, very much. She was determined to have a son, so even though the doctor said, no more kids, no more kids, she got pregnant again. Ta-da, here I came. And I guess I felt like I had to make up for brother and me, so I had all of the energy for 2 kids. I didn't want to go to bed, I didn't want to go to sleep, I might miss something, so I was a very, very active child. But I was also a very happy child. My mother said I woke up in the morning with a smile on my face, I was happy all day long, and I wanted everybody to be happy along with me, which is probably why I became a performer as I was an adult. I wanted to entertain. I wanted you to be happy. I wanted you to have a smile on your face. But I'm getting ahead of my story. I did my first performance when I was 5, and I must have really liked being on that stage. I went through elementary school and school here in Weatherford, but when I turned 15, Mother and Daddy decided to send me to Nashville to go to finishing school. Well, finishing school is code for learn how to be a wife, learn how to run a house, learn how to catch a husband. Boring. I wanted to perform. I wanted to be in theater. I already knew how to talk. My daddy was a lawyer, so I began talking at a young age, and I learned how to talk loudly, and I learned how to present myself. My mother was a violinist and taught violin, so there was music in my house, in my home, and so I picked up music very easily. And then as I started school and started learning, they realized I had a photogenic memory. So what was I going to do at school learning how to be a wife? That did not appeal to me at all. Plus, I already had a boyfriend back in Weatherford waiting for me. I was going to have a husband. He was just back there. He was older than me, and he was just waiting for me to grow up so we could get married. Well, when I was about 16, Ben Hagman and I decided we just might as well get married. This is ridiculous. So we convinced to let us get married. Daddy, he wasn't too hot on the idea, but Mother agreed. So here's the timeline. I'm married at 16. 10 months later, I give birth to Larry Hagman. You might recognize that name. Blue shot, very large. Little hint there. And at 18, I was already bored to tears. I realized this role as a wife, it wasn't going to be for 2 or 3 weeks. It wasn't going to be for 2 or 3 months. It wasn't going to be for 2 or 3 years. This was something, and I was already so bored. And my family and Ben could see how unhappy I was. So Sister said, okay, Mary, you love to perform, you love to sing, you love to dance. Why don't you open a school in Weatherford and teach all the girls how to dance? Have a dancing school, because that'll keep you busy, that'll keep you active, that'll wear you out, give you something to do. Okay, that sounded pretty good, but I didn't know that much how to dance. I mean, I could dance, but I didn't know that many dances, and I certainly didn't know how to teach somebody else how to dance. So I found out about a school in California where I could go to learn dancing and how to teach dancing. So I finally talked Mother, Daddy, and Ben into letting me go, and so I was signed up to go to school for 6 months in California. By that time, Mother was really already raising Larry. Larry was more like a little brother to me than he was my son. And let's face it, Mother was Mother. She was a mother. She was already doing a great job. So I go off to California for 6 months. Big mistake. I loved it. I loved the school. I loved the performing. I loved going to the movies. I loved that they made movies there. I loved that there were stage plays. I loved everything about California. And then I came back to Weatherford. Well, I did my best. I opened not only a school in Mineral Wells, but a school here in Weatherford. And unfortunately, that school got burned to the ground because some man in Weatherford thought that dancing was a sin. And so he just burned the whole thing down. Well, that was very upsetting to me. And I thought, why am I doing this? I'm teaching all these girls how to perform, and I don't get to. They're all going on the stage, and I don't get to go on the stage. So when I was about 20, my dad sat me down one day and said, Mary, you aren't very happy. What's the deal? You're not happy. We can all tell you're not happy. And I said, well, Daddy, I'm just wasting my life. This is not what I was meant to do. I was meant to do something else. My purpose is to do something else. And so it was agreed upon by the family and by Ben Hagman that I returned to California. And so while I was in California, my dad applied for a divorce, and so I got a divorce from Ben Hagman. Turned out okay for Ben. He started out as an accountant. He ended up an attorney, well-known attorney here in Weatherford. He remarried and he had more children, so Larry wasn't an only child. And I did my thing in California. I love living in California. I love being there. They call me Audition Mary because I went for it didn't matter what it was. I auditioned for it. So first of all, I started on the radio. I sang on the radio something like 50 some odd appearances on the radio in California, and then back in Texas when I visited Texas. And I also made films. I made movies in California, and I started out in a silent movie. Can you imagine a singer being in a silent movie? Yeah. But movies were not my thing. They were looking for movie stars. They were looking for beautiful, gorgeous women, and I wanted to sing and dance and be busy. So movies were not really for me. I made 14 of them, but they were really not for me. And then I met Oscar Hammerstein. And Richard Rogers and Oscar Hammerstein changed my life. I was the original Nellie Forbush in the South Pacific. I don't know if you've ever seen it as a play. It started as a play and then they made it into a movie. And some had said that they wrote that play just for me because they thought I would be the perfect Nellie Forbush. I was the original Peter Pan on the stage, and then I did 2 TV appearances. I was the original Maria in The Sound of Music, and I became very close friends with Maria Von Trapp. I was Dolly in Hello Dolly. I was Annie Oakley in Annie Get Your Gun. I was in I Do. And I loved being on the stage. I wanted to make you happy. And if it was your first night, your opening night, I wanted to make it my opening night. So for me, every performance was special because I wanted it to be special for you. About 4 or 5 years after I was in California, I married Richard Halliday. Richard was a theater critic, and then after we married, he became a producer and a co-producer of a lot of my plays. And because he was in the business and he understood, we had a very happy marriage. Larry grew up here in Weatherford. He went on to become a TV star, as I've already mentioned. Don't look for him out here. He's not buried here. He was cremated upon his death, and all his ashes were spread at the South Fork. But when my sweet Richard passed away, we were living in Brazil. We had a ranch in Brazil after we retired, and when Richard passed away, I brought him back here to be buried, knowing that I would join him someday. Those latter years of my life, I began to look back and wonder, did I give too much of myself to strangers? Did I give too much of myself to too many people? Did I rob my family? Did I rob my friends? But a year prior to my death, I received the honors at Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., Kennedy Center of the Performing Arts, and I was given a lovely life tribute. So that did make me feel better. Please walk down and see our markers. Thank you so much.
there, but why don't we talk here? We'll go over there before we leave. This way you get the best shade. So we'll go over by my tombstone. It's over there. Governor Red Okay. I'm a Southerner who became a Texan. And I was a Texan who was always glad that he was a Southerner. You know, I got thinking about the stories that we live by. The stories that we told changed the way that we think about things. 80 years ago, 80 years ago, 80 years ago. Well, 80 years ago was about World War II, 100 years ago, about the Great Depression. Probably some of your grandparents, parents, great-grandparents told you stories about these areas. Well, for me, when I was growing up, as a boy in South Carolina, 100 years ago, our great-great-grandfather's stories had been about whether there had been 200 different incidents whether we were fighting the Revolutionary War in South Carolina. And why did we join the Union? Did we join the Union so that we could go back into a strong government, maybe a king? No. We joined the Union so that we would be able to defend each other and have as much freedom as we could. So when it came to the point that they were going to make us give away and get rid of slavery, for us it wasn't just about slavery. If it was, that was completely wrong. There was 4 million slaves in the South that didn't get a vote. That wasn't right. But for us it was all about states' rights. And so when I was 15 years old, when the war broke out, I went and joined up. I was a private, served in South Carolina, North Carolina, fought some in Tennessee, and eventually I was wounded in the Battle of Spotsylvania. Spotsylvania. Sounds like a dog talking about a vampire, doesn't it? But Spotsylvania was one of the main battles in the Confederate War. There was over 150 soldiers engaged in the Battle of Spotsylvania. 18,000 Union troops and 12,000 Confederate troops were killed, and many wounded. That's 1 out of 5 soldiers. Well, we actually won that war, won that battle, but it probably caused the South to lose the war because we couldn't afford 12,000 soldiers being killed. Lincoln resigned, you know, about a year later at Appomattox. I resigned my company. I'd worked up to just a second sergeant, but my platoon and company we resigned in Greensboro. Then I went back home to South Carolina. 1 year later, I married my wife Sarah. I married my wife Sarah on September the 4th. 1 month after that, we joined up with some other folks that were headed to Texas. There's 15 other folks besides ourselves. We had a covered wagon pulled by 2 horses. It took us 3 months to get here. We got up, we went up to, we were outside of Clarksville, up in East Texas. I taught at a country school up in Clarksville for a year. The next year moved into a little bit larger school over in Old Boston, the next county over. And in 1868, my wife and I moved to Weatherford. We lived in a log cabin over on Spring Street. 1 room was the school. A different room was the one that we lived in. It wasn't a life of prosperity. I decided that I didn't want to be a teacher for the rest of my life, so I started studying law. And in 1869, I was admitted to the bar in Weatherford. 1821, it was fortuitous to me that the governor appointed me in the five county area to be the district attorney. I say it's fortuitous timing because there was a great massacre of a wagon train in the area of Graham now. It was a wagon train that was hauling supplies from Fort Richardson, present-day Jacksboro, out to Fort Griffin. Indians came from the Indian reservations in Oklahoma, and it came down to attack. That had been going on over and over again because they could come down, Texans would chase them back, and then as soon as they went across the Red River, we had no authority up there, so we couldn't follow them. So we've been complaining to the federal government, and they'd sent General Sherman down to check out our complaints. General Sherman had gone through that very same pass where the wagon train massacre was the day before. The massacre It involved around 20 men, 3 lived, the rest of them were scalped or brutally murdered. One man was tied to a wagon wheel, tortured, and then burned to death. All of this, because of General Sherman's close proximity, made the national news. It was decided that we would prosecute them as citizens, not as enemy combatants. There was 3 main chiefs that had gone back to Fort Sill and bragged on the fact that they were. But one of them bragged on the fact that he was the one that led the raid. It was just his pride and arrogance that set him up for being prosecuted. He was scared that some of the other ones, one of the other young chiefs named Kickingbird, would take credit for it. He went up there bragging and says, even if Kickingbird says that he was in charge, he was not, I was. Anyway, 3 of the Indian chiefs were being brought down to Jacksboro. You've heard of a suicide by cop. This was kind of suicide by soldier. One of the chiefs chewed his arm to the point that he could finally pull his arm out of the shackle and attempted to escape and was shot. The other 2 were prosecuted. We decided that this needed to be a model to say that we were treating the Indians fairly, and so district attorneys from Weatherford were each one of the chiefs had his own defense attorney, and we brought them up, and it was all in the national newspapers. That's fortuitous for me, I guess, because all of my speeches about how we had to prosecute these guys and for the sake of justice, all those got reported in the national newspapers over and over. They even got copied, and poor schoolboys had to memorize those speeches for years. Some months after that, or some years after that, I got involved in politics. I was a U.S. Senator, I was a U.S. Congressman, not a senator. I was a U.S. Congressman for 10 years. It was a pretty small district, it's, from Parker County out to El Paso. So that was one of the things we got done. We set up a court district in El Paso. Finally got the courthouse built out in El Paso. After 10 years, I decided I wanted to run for the governor of Texas. I did run. I thought I'd win, but I didn't. I didn't even get to the ballot. More about that later. Went back to Congress for another 6 years. Decided to run for governor. Came back, made it through the process, the convention process, and finally got to become the candidate and was able to become governor. The reason I brought that up is because that was one of the reforms that we did, because before then, whoever controlled the convention was able to manipulate the timing and pull the strings and whatnot and get that person elected. There was no election to determine who your primary candidate was. So we got that reform, got that changed. The next year we got a little bit more transparency, got rid of some child labor, made some child labor laws, how long railroad people could work. And one of the things that we worked at, was to try to take out some of the tax burden of property owners in Texas. We weren't completely successful, were we? So we did get railroad companies, freight companies, and some oil companies taxed to try to help with the burden. But I know the property taxes are still high. In my second term as governor, it was a mess. There had been a Standard Oil Company in Texas that violated some of Texas's rights. It had gone all the way up to the Supreme Court, where Texas said that they couldn't do any business in Texas. And finally the Supreme Court had ruled in Texas's favor. And so the Standard Oil Company, through its shell company that was the Waters Pierce Oil Company, were thrown out of Texas. The Waters Pierce Oil Company came back and said, we're no longer owned by Standard Oil, and you ought to allow us to operate in Texas. They finally got a right to operate in Texas, and in my second term it was found out that the senator, the U.S. senator from Texas, Senator Bailey, had been on the payroll of Standard Oil whenever he pushed through so that they could get to operating back in Texas. It was a mess. It wasn't part of my party. I was involved in state politics, not national politics, but it was crazy stressful. I told people, I didn't run for another term of office, came back to Weatherford pretty much a broken man. My health was broken. I told my friends and family that I wish I just stayed in the Congress and never run for governor, because when you were the governor, people were hounding you for a pardon, hounding you to run for an office, or hounding you to try to do business with the state of Texas. I only lived about 1.5 years after I came back. I was a diabetic, and diabetes was very serious back then. They didn't start treating diabetics with insulin until the 1920s. Some people said that I might have died of a broken heart. My wife Sarah died of July the 2nd, and I died of July the 29th the same year. Before you go, I have to brag about my sons. One of my sons followed me. It's right over here. This kind of gets you moving to the next person. But my son Fritz, he followed my footsteps. He became a district attorney over in Tarrant County, and then went to Washington as a congressman. He was not foolish like I did. He never ran for governor, but was a congressman for 28 years for that part of the country, representing Tarrant County. And the federal building over in Fort Worth is named after him. It's the Fritz G. Lanham Federal Building. My fourth son, Edwin, only lived to be 31, but before he passed away, he had another son, Edward Moultrie Lanham Jr. Jr. became a famous novelist. After World War I, he joined a merchant ship and sailed around the world. He went back to Paris and wrote his first book. It was called Sailors Don't Care. If it had been after Gone with the Wind, we know how that title would have been. But that was the first of 22 novels that he wrote. One of them was about Texas. It was called The Wind Blows West. I think he included me in that story. But he was quite famous. He died in 1979. His obituary was in the New York Times, and the New York Times said that he was a famous mystery writer, historical writer, and a New York newspaper man. So I continue to be glad I came to Texas, but I always am proud I was from the South. They're not coming yet, so I'll tell you one more thing. There was the Daughters of the Confederacy in Weatherford were named after me. They called themselves the Jim Lanham Chapter, the Sam Lanham Chapter. And they were the folks that worked together, started in 1903, after I came home from the governorship, to work on starting to get a statue erected on the square. They didn't get it done till 1923, but that statue that is now on the west side of the square, that was almost named after me. It's not me, but that's an interesting part of my history. Thank y'all so much for coming.
Thank you.
I'm Molly Goodnight, wife of Charles Goodnight, the famous rancher and cattleman. He always called me Mary, but actually everybody else called me Molly. And I'm going to share a little bit about Bose Eicher today. He was a very dear friend to Charles. And I'll tell you a little bit about how their friendship developed. Bose Eicher was born into slavery in 1843 in Somerville, Mississippi. His master was Dr. Milton Eicher. There's some speculation that he might have been Bose's father, and his mother a slave named King. Excuse us, that's my husband Charles. He'll talk to you in just a minute. Dr. Eicher moved his family, slaves and all, to Louisiana as he moved westward, and then by 1852 they were in Texas in Lamar County, and by 1855 they ended up here in Parker County. Well, Dr. Eicher bought a ranch or a farm on the far west side of the county, on the edge of the Comanche, Iowa frontier. So even though Bose was just still a young child, a young boy, he was exposed to Indian raids and what it meant to be a cowboy. And as he grew up, he learned about ranching and farming and the real cowboy way. He served in the Civil War, and when he came back, he was free. He stayed with Dr. Eichert for a while. Then he started working for Oliver Loving as a ranch hand. Well, Oliver, his ranch hands were having trouble with this bronc. Nobody could break him. Excuse me, take a breath here. Well, Bo started bragging he could break that bronc. He'd never broken a bronc in his life. Well, he had to prove he could do it. He bit down on that horse's mane with his teeth and hung on, and he broke that horse. Well, after that, he was known as a great horse breaker. And he was on his way to his reputation as one of the greatest cowboys in the West. About that time, Oliver and Charles started thinking about a cattle trail between here and Colorado. And Bo's was so important to the development of that, very important. He was not only a cattle driver, he was a tracker, and he was Charles's banker. Charles entrusted thousands of dollars to Bo's to keep until they could get it deposited. So after being on the trail for 4 years with Charles and Oliver Loving, he decided he wanted to settle down, and by 1869 he wanted to settle in Colorado. Charles talked to him and told him there weren't very many black people in Colorado. You might want to come back to Parker County. So by about 1871, Bose came back to Parker County. He bought some land, but it was still a problem of Indian raids. So he rode with his former master, Milton Eichert, and they ran skirmishes against Quanah Parker and his Comanche band. Eventually, Bose met Angelina.
Thank you. As Mary said, I'm Charles Goodnight, rancher, inventor, invented the chuck wagon. I'm a pretty good tracker, scout myself, cattle driver, and movie producer late in life. Done a little bit of everything. They've asked me to talk to you about a good friend Bo's here for it. I'm sorry I'm losing my voice, but that's Parker County for you. Well, the best man I ever knew. He did his job. He always did it cheerfully. He always did it without complaining. He was always the best man on the trail ride. I can remember many a time when we were on a trail drive, and I'd been in the saddle 5-6 days straight. You ever ridden a horse for any length of time? You know that it ain't that much fun. And we'd push it. I couldn't push it. So I'd ask Bose, can you take over for a while? I get a little rest off the saddle. He always said, yes, sir, not a problem. He always did it with a smile, confidence, and he always did a great job. I trust this man with anything. When Bose passed away in 1928, about a year before I did, I contacted a Mr. Stanley. He was the head of the Weatherford School District, and asked him, would you make arrangements for the proper burial of my good friend, Mr. Riker? And he said yes, and they did. Did a great job, found this nice spot. And I contacted the Weatherford Granite and Marble Company and had his headstone made. It cost me $60. It was worth every penny of it. But wish I could have done more for it. Now, there's been a few books written about our adventures. The most, I guess, the most well known is Lonesome Dove. If you haven't read it, you really ought to. And it's accurate-ish. No, most of the adventures in the book, we experienced most of what was written about. Maybe not quite as colorfully, but we did. Read the book. Another book, if you can find it, called Cry Unheard, about the Indian deprivations here in around Parker County. A lot of good history in this these few acres. Anyway, as you go out through today, we're going to have other notable people to visit. Our good friend Oliver Loving is buried right over there. Be sure to stop by there for a few minutes. He kind of completes our story. Any questions? Any of us?
Is his wife buried here?
She's buried over there. She died in 1902.
1902?
1902. And he was 1928, so many years apart in the cemetery and shifted and changed.
You can see two little small identical ones, maybe the second row there, two little small ones, and then a flat one, and then hers is that one that stands up to the left. I believe that's what someone's going to check because I believe she wasn't very good. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you. Drinking water. See what I look like about 3 o'clock. Y'all will have more shade the further you go. Thank you, Nancy. No, it has some, it says FD. We don't really know what that is. Thank you.
Thank you.
John W. Vandergrift. I was born, here's a photo of John I'm going to pass around. I was born on the 25th of August in 1859 in Pinckneyville, Illinois. I married John William Vandergrift, who was born in Knox County, Tennessee in 1853. We married here in Weatherford in June 10th, 1883, when John was 30 and I was 24 years old. We lived at 606 North Walnut Street, which is just right over here a few blocks away, and all 6 of our children were born in that home. John operated a cafe on Austin Avenue near the livery stables. In 1897, we transferred our membership from the First Baptist Church to the Second Baptist Church, where John served as a deacon and led the music occasionally. We were also instrumental in forming Northside Baptist Church, which is still in existence here in town. At only 46 years old, John contracted pneumonia. He passed away, well, first of all, he gathered our children around his bed and sang "There is a Fountain." Then he passed away on April 25th, 1899. I was left 40 years old with 6 children and no income. So I did what women often do at the time. I took in laundry. I did washing for people, I sewed for people, I did whatever I could to help make ends meet. Times were very tough, but we did survive. I did something that few women did. I went before the congregation and I asked for forgiveness and confessed my sins and told them I was ready to go home with God. But God had other plans for me. And in August of 1908, I was elected the president of the Ladies Aid Society as it was organized here in Weatherford. I died October 7th, 1913. And I'm buried right here beside John. I have to refer to my notes because a lot of these things happened after I died. And so I don't know them that well. Our oldest, Charles Vandergrift, was born in 1844. He was a publicity man for Ringling Brothers Circus here in Weatherford. He was also a writer for the Weatherford Democrat, a manager of the Weatherford baseball team, and he served in C Company of the 4th Infantry of the local National Guard. He was also a driver for the fire station. He served at the fire station for 10 years before passing away there on the 12th of November 1918 during the Great Flu Epidemic. In Weatherford, over 800 people passed away during the flu epidemic. Think the size Weatherford was in 1918. To lose 800 of your citizens was really a hard blow to our community. Our daughter Grace married Frank Combs. He was a master mechanic. They moved to Ohio for a while and then back to Weatherford. They had 7 children, one of which, Dawn, is buried right here. Grace died in 1925 in Fort Worth, where they were living, and she is buried there. James Vernon Vandergriff, our second son, was involved in the grocery business of the Rock Creek Coal Company and then the Texas Pacific Coal Oil Company before operating the Model Grocery on North Main Street for 42 years. John Roy was involved in the building industry. He was born in 1890. He built commercial and residential structures here in Weatherford, and he retired in the early 1960s before passing away in 1965. He is actually buried over across the way in the East Greenwood Cemetery. Now Harry here, he was our adventurous one. He left home in 1908 on a bicycle and traveled all over the United States. You think about what bicycles were like in 1908, and he rode one all over the United States. That's just baffling to me. During the Great War in 1917, he joined the Navy and served on the USS South Dakota. He came back to Weatherford and operated a cafe, the Cozy Cove. He married, and his only biological child died shortly after birth. I'm not sure where that child is buried because it's not in this plot. Then Harry and his wife adopted a girl named Dolores, but she and the child moved to California, leaving Harry here in Weatherford. He moved his cafe across the street and renamed it Harry's. He was known to make the best hamburger in town. He was a mentor and successor to Claude Smith. I'm sure you've all heard of Claude Smith hamburgers if you're from Weatherford. Harry was also a painter, and many of his pictures hung in the cafe. He died in 1978. Our youngest, Paul, also served in the Navy during the Great War, and he served on the USS Louisiana. After the war, Paul settled in Los Angeles, where he worked for the Postal Service, and he was a clerk at the post office in LA. And he died in 1976 at the age of 79. But that's enough about me and my family. I'll let you folks move on along and visit with somebody in the shade somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
Yeah, I said I'm glad we started as early as we did.
My understanding, restrooms are dangerous here in Parker County, so I put this gun.
Oh.
Okay. Howdy. My name is Oliver Loving. I was born in Hopkins County, Kentucky, December 4th, 1812. I was a tall, red-headed, blue-eyed young man that said, and they said I had a sense of humor about me. I married a girl named Susan Morgan when I was 21 years old. We farmed there in Kentucky for the next 10 years. During that 10-year period, we had 5 kids. I would have more later on. I'll tell you about that when we get to it. But Susan and I were married there and lived there for a number of years. My brother James married Susan's sister Margaret. In 1845, the year that Texas became a state, we had heard from Kentucky that Texas was going to become a state, and we also heard how magnificent this place was. My brother James and I wanted to see it for ourselves, so we told the wives, we're going to go to Texas, visit, we'll be back. So we came to Texas. We saw what we just could not believe as far as opportunity goes, land. You know, we could raise cattle here, do what we wanted to do. Everything would be great. And it's going to become a state, which it did at the end of that year. We went back to Kentucky, convinced our wives to move here and bring the families and come on. When we did, we settled at the It was called the Peters Colony Settlement, which is that way, east of here, the next county over, a place called Mansfield, I believe you call it. That was where the Peters Colony Settlement was. We lived there for a number of years. We farmed, we ranched. The population wasn't bad, but I needed more space, more land for myself. And so after a period of years, after we'd had 4 more kids, we now had 9, I decided to take my wife and kids and move to Palapino County over here. My brother stayed over there. But we moved to Palapino, and I bought my net worth when I left over there was about $1,700, which may not sound like a lot of money now, but back then it was. Went to Palapino County. I got 1,000 acres of land. I built a log cabin. I built a store, and I built a post office. My main source of income though was cattle driving, and I drove a lot of cattle out there, from there to Illinois, to Shreveport, to New Orleans, wherever. And that was how I made my living. And that was where I was tagged with the name, the Dean of the Texas Trail Drivers. And everything was going great until the Civil War broke out. When the Civil War broke out, it kind of threw a monkey wrench in everything. I made an agreement, signed a contract with the Confederate Army that I would provide meat to the Confederate soldiers. So I was still doing cattle drives in that direction, and everything was going great until the Confederates lost that war. When the Confederates lost that war, they owed me about $200,000, and I never saw that money. It was gone. Confederate money was worthless, and I lost it all. The last trip I made for the Confederate soldiers, when I came home, I got home to Palapino, my wife and family was gone. The cattle were gone. My fences were tore up. Comanche raids had caused all this problem. My wife had fled. I didn't know it. I didn't know where she was. I came to Weatherford because we had a daughter living here, and when I came to Weatherford, I found them here. So everything was okay. I still had my family. So this was when I became a resident of Weatherford, Texas. It was then. While I was here, I became a Mason, and I was on the first police force here in Weatherford. And number 3, I also met a guy named Charles Goodnight. Charles Goodnight is probably a name that you know and have heard. Charles Goodnight and I became partners, and we formed a huge cattle operation, okay? And we still went on cattle drives and took beef everywhere. Suddenly there became a need for beef out west to Fort Sumner and to Colorado. There were a lot of miners out there. They were digging for gold and whatever, and so we had to take a lot of beef that direction. At this point, I'm going to ask you a question. Why would we, when we deliver beef to Fort Sumner, which is that way, right over there, that's west northwest, why didn't we go in a straight line from A to B to take our cattle? Can anybody answer that?
Maybe dangerous?
Indians, danger. We wanted to keep our scalps. If we had gone that way, we wouldn't have made it, okay? So, what did we do? We actually drove cattle from here down northwest of San Antonio. And from there, we would go towards San Angelo and then to Pecos, Texas. We had to go and make a huge semicircle around Indian territory so we could be safe. When we got to Pecos, you follow the Pecos River on up to Fort Sumner. That's kind of the edge of Indian territory right there, okay? So, what we did, that's what was come to be known as the Goodnight Loving Trail, was from Pecos to Fort Sumner. What we did when we got to Pecos, we'd send a couple of scouts ahead along the river to make sure everything was safe. And the scout would be gone for a couple of days and come back and, you know, meet with the herd, and then they'd go scout some more. Well, on the third trip, me and a guy named Wilson were the scouts. We decided we would scout. We went on ahead. We would travel at night, not during the daytime. We'd travel at night because that was safer. So we traveled up the river for a couple of days, and I finally talked Wilson into this. I said, listen, man, I don't want to travel at night. I'd rather travel in the day. Let's just do it during the day. He said, okay. Well, that was a fatal mistake because we traveled during the day that next day, and we ran into a bunch of Indians that didn't like us, and we got into a big fight. And in that fight, I took a bullet through the wrist, and the bullet went into my side. And I thought the wound was fatal. And so I told Wilson, I said, you go back to Goodnight in the herd, tell them what happened, and tell them I will not be taken alive. The Indians will not take me alive. Just tell him that. And I'm going to try to get to Fort Sumner the best way I can. If I don't make it, I don't make it. So Wilson went back to the herd. I made it to Fort Sumner. When I got there, I had gangrene in my arm. They cut my arm off right here, amputated my arm. And actually, they thought they had done a pretty good job and thought I was going to make it. But a couple of days later, I had some type of a artery that exploded, and I had major problems again over here, and they couldn't fix it. They just told me I was going to die. Fortunately, Goodnight got there before I did die. He found me there in Fort Sumner. And we had a conversation. In that conversation, I said, I want two things. Number one, I want you to take my part of these cattle, and for the next 2 years, all the cattle I've got back home, for the next 2 years, you take care of my family. You give them my part of the money that you get out of the cattle. Number two, I want you to get me out of this foreign country when I die, and you make sure you bury me back in Weatherford, Texas. And he said, okay. So he went on from there and probably delivered cattle into Colorado to those miners or whatever. He came back to Fort Sumner. I was dead. They had buried me in a shallow grave, waiting on Goodnight to come back, and so they could take me back to Texas. And Goodnight found a way to get me back. I think my son was involved with that. One of my sons was involved with that, and they brought me back to Weatherford, some 600 miles on that trip. And that's why I am buried here, and that is my wife beside me. She lived several years longer, and but she lived here in Weatherford, and she is buried here with me. Does anybody have any questions? Mighty quiet group. Mighty quiet. Can I tell you one more little story? If you want to know the truth, they put the body in a wooden box lined with tin cans that had been flattened out and nailed inside the box, and the body was laid in there. That's what I understand.
Oh my goodness.
Yep. One more story I want to tell you. This is Rusk Street right here. 4 blocks up Rusk Street at the corner of Rusk and First, my great-grandfather built a house right there. My great-grandfather died when he was 104. I was 24. He roofed his house when he was 99. Okay? So I was a teenage boy, and I used to talk to him, and I said, Grandpa, he was half Cherokee Indian, by the way, and he came to Texas, and he was born in 1875, came to Texas, crossed the Red River from Oklahoma with a wife and 3 kids, and he wasn't even 18 years old yet, okay? They did things different back in those days. All right, so here I am asking him, I said, Grandpa, I said, what did you do for a living back when you was 17, 18 years old like me? He said, well, I worked for this big cattleman here in Parker County. I went on cattle drives and broke wild horses for him. I got paid 50 cents a day. Well, that didn't mean much to me back then. But as time went on, you watch a movie called Lonesome Dove, and you put 2 and 2 together. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, worked for Charles Goodnight out of Parker County right here. So in 2019, I had a bunch of people after me to write a book. I wrote a book in 2019, and I put a chapter in that book called Old Jim Clark, and I tell the story about, I've given you the short version, the quick version, but how he came from Oklahoma and worked for Captain Call. Can we say that? Yep. Anyway, I appreciate you listening, and you are free to, I think you go, but that guy's a weird guy. That's some really weird stuff going on there. And I don't understand it. I'm not sure I want to understand it. But y'all are free to go.
DC, and I hope you'll call me DC also, because I'd like to consider you my friends. Today I'm here to tell you about my family's contribution to Parker County, and that would be the Haynes Opera House. The Opera House, my wife and I, Marguerite, built in 1887, and it was built at the corner of York and Dallas, on the northwest corner of the square. So if you'll think about the Parker County Square today and where it is, my beautiful opera house, which was on the second floor. First floor was my grocery store that my wife and I ran. But that location is now housed by a law firm. Big tall guy, a little short guy, kind of reminds you of Laurel and Hardy, but I can't use the Laurel and Hardy joke. They told me I wouldn't. So, wanted to let you know that that's where we built our opera house. Our opera house operated from 1887 to 1914. Unfortunately, I passed away in 1894 and didn't get to see the entire usage of the opera house. But luckily, my son, Charles, was able to carry on the family name, and he carried on the tradition of the opera house until 1914. We created the opera house to have a place for cultural entertainment, and the cultural entertainment that would be of a wholesome value and not of a risque or scandalous value, as was the form of entertainment out in the Wild West out here back in that day. In 1914, mysteriously, late at night, the building burned to the ground, both floors, and surprisingly, my son was offered a very handsome amount of money the next day by the local bank to purchase the property. So, always a colorful past here in Parker County. One thing though that might really disappointed my family was you see no historical markers around the courthouse square to talk about the history of the Haynes family, or either to talk about the history of the opera house, which was the cultural and the entertainment center of the courthouse area for 25-30 years. So my wife Marguerite, prior to her passing in 1925, built a monument so that those that would come by and pass by and see it would know what the Haynes family's contribution to Parker County was. It gives me the opportunity to sit here today and tell you of the contribution my family made. And I thank you for taking your time to listen to this today. And I realize that I am the last, and I've been out here for a while. I know it's hot. Y'all are probably dying of heat. I'm not, I'm dead. So, you know, sorry guys, but don't want to keep y'all anymore. Let y'all get into the shade. Want to remind you of one last thing. Today is election day. I don't care which way you vote, but please go vote. Because on behalf of all of my neighbors, some people came out here early in the week and they took all of our votes. So we've all voted out here, meaning that they recorded dead votes of dead people, like they did back in the political elections. Okay, I can tell you guys are too young to remember that joke. All right, sorry. Hey, at least you got the other joke. Y'all have a great day.
Thank
you. Thank you for coming, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You know, y'all are the first group that didn't get that joke. Y'all are young.
Our neighbors are there this weekend. I don't want to.
Thank you. Bye. Yep.
Two has come untied.